Phil, if you'd like to go on to the introduction slide, thank you. Thank you. Welcome to all for this webinar, where we'll be discussing how to identify your stakeholders and, more importantly, how to reduce the risk of getting it wrong. It's coming to you from both the People Interest Network and the Systems Thinking Interest Network, both part of the Association of Project Management. We will present to you two different scenarios for open discussion. Please do get involved. Ask your questions in the question panel that you will see on your screen, and we will endeavour to answer them for you. Our panelist today is Phil, and can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, so Phil Macey. I've been a project manager for 20 odd years, mainly involved with technology and IT type projects. I'm now no longer active. I am not managing any projects at the moment, and basically spending my time using my experience and academic research to improve project management.
Thanks, Phil. Jasper, can you introduce yourself, please?
Afternoon, everyone. Happy Monday. I've been told apparently there's such a thing. So I'm Jasper. I'm part of the People Network and also part of the London Network. And like the rest of my panelists, fellow of the APM, my forte is in delivering transformational change programs and working with stakeholders to try and motivate them and ensure that we deliver the best possible outcome. So I'm very excited to be here today to work and learn with you all. Welcome.
Thank you, Jasper. The other two people you might see on the screens is myself, Ian Crivis, and Gareth David, and we're the ones who are going to be facilitating this. So we will try and monitor your questions and feed them over to the panel as and when we get them in. Thank you now, and over to Phil for the first scenario.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Before I start, just so that we're all on the same sheet of music, we as a group have decided we'll use this definition. The good thing about this definition is that is the word perceive, as all of us listening to this are probably well aware. When we look at stakeholders, we're often surprised that they perceive a project slightly differently from us as the project manager. And so we've added that to it. So the first scenario, as you can see there, it's enterprise resource planning, big technology insertion for this particular organisation. In our scenario, the project manager has never worked with this organisation, know a few people in it. It's probably you're beginning to relate to yourselves as you're looking at this, thinking, I've been there, I've had to do this. There's a sponsor. Whether it's the right sponsor is an interesting question. It's obviously all been approved. They've approved the money, so we've gone through that bit. They've obviously had put some form of plan together. There's been some ideas as who could join you as your team. And so we're now at that stage where you've been given that, you're now working at who are the stakeholders in all of this. Ian.
Still on mute. My apologies to everybody. The first question I want to throw to you both yourself, Phil, and to Jasper, is that what are your initial thoughts about stakeholders, particularly with regard to the scenario that Phil's just outlined?
Yeah, I think my first feeling, looking back at that scenario, is literally keep calm. This is a big organisation. They've got over 80 stores around the countryside. They're big, but I need to work out a way of, how is all of this connected? Who's working with whatever? And if I just bring up this slide here, it gives an idea of my identification challenge. Actually, probably the top left is quite straightforward. I can go and get the organisation chart, but does that really tell me what's going on in the organisation? There's a whole pile of systems that are operating in this thing. Some are directly involved, and then that over to the right is what really sort of worries me. There's lots of them, and they've got, as the slide shows, their own experiences, their own views, which are probably different from me. So it's all a bit volatile. It's unknown how they will react. ERP will impact different services. Which ones, I'm not sure. There's a certain amount of uncertainty in all of this. In simple terms, is how I will be received as the project manager. It's quite complicated. There's lots of different systems involved. There's lots of different people. There's geography involved. And it's also difficult at the moment to understand how all these stakeholders react. So it's quite challenging. But I think what I need to do as I look at this is I can't do this on my own, and I'm going to need to engage these stakeholders to get some support. Jasper.
I mean, my initial thought always when I'm in a situation like this is panic, panic, panic. So that's always my first instinct to tell myself there is no need to panic. You are not alone. Resource is being directed toward this, right? So I need to bear this in mind throughout the project so we work out what we need to do and who is best placed to help us do this. Just like Phil, I agree there is a lot to map out here, but again, it's remembering a change manager has been assigned as well as the luxury of having an assistant PM. But this is also important to bear in mind to ensure there is no overlap of roles here because that could lead to a big waste in terms of resources. Another one of my initial thoughts, I think, is that I may not know who all the stakeholders are. So speaking with the PMO, speaking with the CIO, I would like to ask him, what are his initial thoughts on this? Is everyone behind the delivery of this ERP? Should we expect any resistance to just start gathering thoughts on how much everyone is clued in into what's happening and how much they want to make it happen? And then to start building a plan from there.
Thanks, Jasper. And I think with the point that's coming from both of our panelists there is that identifying the stakeholder is important, but it's not always that obvious who the stakeholder might be. Just a couple of, I'm going to throw a question at you now, just to see if we can get the ball rolling with our audience. Is that how would you go about trying to identify the stakeholders? And a sort of a follow-up to that is that why do you think that's important?
In terms of identifying stakeholders, it will be helpful to know. So after speaking with the CIO, ask him, for example, who else will be using the system, what they need to use it for, and then that will help me start identifying who the users are, and then speak with them and start clarifying if this is the case. And I think with ERP systems are so different and so complicated. So once I start understanding who I can start speaking with, ask the people on the ground at the end of the conversation, what do you need to use the system for? Who else will be using the system? So who do you recommend I go and speak with? So my approach is very much about trying to start to draw my stakeholders in a little bit and start engaging with them, and then I can start creating the sort of user requirements and maps in the background. But yeah, it all starts with trying to speak with people, seeing what they know and whom they think are other key people I could be speaking with. Because I'll say, look, I'm sorry, I'm new. I don't really know everyone in the organization, so it'll be really good if you can tell me who else this ERP system is going to have an impact on and get the conversation rolling that way.
So I think in extension to that as well, Jasper, we've had a question from Ashok, or actually he passed a view really, which was around sort of looking at the documentation. And I think that kind of resonates quite a lot with what you've just said in terms of looking at the documentation, the goals, the scope, because I think there's an extension to that, what you've just said. It's about people who are going to be affected by this. But if you don't know what it is, how would you know if they're going to be affected or perceived to be affected by it?
Indeed.
If I can I think my first step is really working out what I'm trying to achieve in a broad sense. So that business case that's been mentioned, and then what support is needed to achieve that, and then what are my knowledge gaps? What don't I know? What assumptions have I made? And also looking at those objectives as to how those objectives will impact on people, and trying to get that sort of feel from it. It's really sort of about appreciating that situation. What is the problem, and then really because one way of trying to understand that is perhaps trying to work out, what's their business model? What parts of it will be impacted? There's some, I've got a slide here. There's a very useful tool that gives you that overview of the whole thing, of how it all links together, and how all those bits all, what processes are there. And then just trying to understand, and there's, there's a very simple model such as these are all, there's lots of versions. This one's quite nice because it sort of gives you there, so you can start filling it in with sort of various views. I think the key thing when picking up your point, Jasper, is the questions, is to try and focus those questions. And this is taking a tool that's been around for many years, actually. But what it's trying to do is to sort of where the sources of the project influence are coming from. What is the motivation? Why on earth are they even doing it? Who's in charge? Who has the knowledge? Because that's what you're grasping for as a project manager. Who knows what's going on? Who should I speak to? Should I trust their knowledge? And then, the acceptability. Which is back to where we often think in stakeholders, who's going to be impacted, and we think of well, that's probably a sort of follow-on sort of question. But I think those are nice little questions. I think finally, to sort of wrap that up at this moment, the other thing we need to be aware is with my how is just working where the power is. And as we probably all experience by project managers, this often surprises us to where the power actually is, as where that power is coming from. And this nice model here again, it's been, as you can see it's been around for a long time, but it does allow you just to ask some more questions of yourself as to, look at each stakeholder. And I've known some project managers who actually catalogue all of this and create a sort of a sort of book. I must admit, with this audience here, that I have never been that systematic about it. It sort of normally sits in my head and there's the odd note, but I have worked with project managers who actually put that down there. And I think the bottom two are quite useful as to what support can the project manager, this stakeholder, give me. Also, how can this stakeholder actually put a sanction on it? I disrupt what I'm trying to do.
I've got a question that's come up here from Jane Wilkinson. In your experience, either of you or both of you, is there an identification template? I know you put a lot of things up there, Phil, and they're very useful. Is there an identification template that you would go to or use that would initially help to map out your stakeholders that you're going to engage with? Or will one of those that you've put in fill that need, Phil?
Yeah, I think this one I've put up here, I've used for a number of years. It is extracted from a good book on stakeholder engagement, actually, by Linda Bourne, because what it does for me, sideways, upwards, downwards, is that reality. It's the arrows. It makes me start to look at the links and the relationships and the conversations that are taking place as to who's actually involved. And so this I use as my starter, but I think, as we've just been discussing, it quickly gets a little bit more complicated. And but if you want a starter, I'd recommend this as a starter. Jasper?
Phil, and you know what's interesting about this diagram you've pulled up? I have a feeling you created this yourself and it's not something AI created. It's so nice and clear and easily sets out the tone, I think. So.
Yeah, I must admit, like I said, I cannot take the credit for it. Linda Bourne has produced it. I believe is Australian, and she's put it. I just found it, and of all the ones that I've used over the years, I just always go to this one. It's which I think is the question you're saying, Ian. It's that starter to get you off the ground, and you start filling. What it often does is identifies gaps. You don't know.
Yeah, there's another one's coming in here from Mike Wyndham. How much would you want to connect with local expertise versus forming your own understanding?
Um, that's a wonderful question. I think my personal preference is very much when I'm new in an organization, I want to connect to the local expertise, find out how they do things, find out how they work. I'm bringing my expertise along with me anyway, but before I start imposing my ideas on them, it'll be really good to understand how it all functions before I suggest how it can be done. And that way, I think it's also a very good way to try and build that connections. And there's less chance of then alienating your stakeholders who may feel that, oh, look at who she is. She's come in here and she's tried to come and tell us how to do it all. We know how to do it all. So I think trying to understand what local expertise there is really important, because then it also tells you what resources you have to help you deliver this new ERP program. So for me, it's quite important. What do you say, Phil?
I think I want to look at it in two ways. They're related. I think what is often a danger, if you've done an ERP project before, you could have this danger because you'll quickly have these templates in your head to say, this is how I did it last time. And I think it's that realization, which I'm sure many of listening can relate to, is each organisation is very different. In fact, each organisation is adjusting, and so you come to this thing, but you start have a risk. You start making assumptions, which is your point that you've got to stop doing that. I have sort of a mantra: as soon as you make an assumption, try to make it as a fact as quickly as possible, because while it's an assumption, it's not a fact. It's how you assume. I think this also brings up another thing that I've realised, and this slide probably puts this in context, is I often find I'm part of the problem because I have my own experiences, my own knowledge, my own skills, views, biases, and when I'm engaging with a stakeholder, these come in. So someone tells me something and I go, oh yes, I know that. So I think it's really important that we as project managers or people trying to identify stakeholders realize this and reflect on ourselves that we're within this whole stakeholder identification, because many times I dismissed a stakeholder who I thought wasn't important, and in the end starts to be important because I had a prejudice. He or she is just a junior project manager. What does he or she know about this? And it's all because of those things that are listed on this slide, that those prejudices that we all have, and that's. I've seen bigger lists than that, and it's those that get you that risk of assumption, which is back to the point that I think you brought the question asked here, is you've got to ask and go out there and get the knowledge from the people. The biggest risk is to assume that you know it.
Here's a follow-up question for you then, and how do you best deal with resistance to either the project and or the project manager?
Yeah. And I think just to add to that, Ian, there was also a question from Rachel. So the other side of that is, how do you manage that participation and feedback and decision making? I think that's part and parcel of the same piece.
Right. Thanks, Gareth. Panel?
Ian, could you just repeat that? We went to the other side, which slightly diverged my view.
What Ethan is asking for is how do you best deal with resistance to either the project or the project manager? It just ties in a little bit with am I the problem on that.
Why don't I take the first one, Phil, then you can have the second bit. Resistance to the PM. Now, this is really interesting. We could go at this one for 3 hours, I think. And I think what helps is trying to understand the root cause of the resistance. Are they resistant to the PM and the project because it means changing their ways of working? Is it because it's going to be more work for them? Is their job threatened? So finding out the root cause, I find, often helps me understand then what measures we can put in place to try and decrease the resistance. That's my initial thought.
Yeah, I think it's one of those key things that as a project manager that we all have to have, is that building up of those relationships and getting to understand the people and where they fit in, and you know, often, especially something like an ERP, the fears are going to be enormous. You know, am I going to lose my job? Is my job description going to change? And trying to sort of appreciate those and trying to sort of understand that stakeholder. I've also got another lovely little diagram, but it sort of brings out that bit that we're trying to understand is to sort of, until you understand, it's very difficult to overcome the resistance, because you've got to sort of understand how they perceive what is going on, which is back to our definition that we brought in the first place, to realise that they have a different view of it, that lovely phrase, what's in it for me? Because until you've done that, and that really is, I suppose, going to the next bit, which is the engagement, which is certainly out with our webinar today. Maybe in a future webinar we'll challenge the engagement side of things. Here we're trying to identify, and what by this lovely little cartoony diagram is trying to say is people have all got different perceptions, and as we're identifying them, unless we understand that perception and what that potential resistance is, why they're even frightened as to what we're trying to do with them, especially with, like, you know, in ERP, you know, they probably had a really bad experience last time somebody put an ERP. Luckily, businesses don't do it every day. I understand it's about every 5 to 10 years, because it's a big monster to put in. But it's to improve your engagement, which is, I think, is what these two sides of the question have got to do. Identification is a bit more than just a name, place, and a role, in my view. You've got to identify the feeling behind it, the politics and the atmosphere, or the sort of, you know, I suppose what their own prejudices are.
So I think then as an overlay, the kind of the second part of that, Phil, really was around sort of managing the overall participation, not just the sort of the good news story, so to speak. I think there's another question about this is quite a common sense approach, which I think is right. But I guess the question to the panel and yourself, Phil, really would be how are you managing just generally the participation? And we've had a few questions around sort of use of any templates in particular that you'd recommend.
I think, yeah. One that I'll just bring up here is that sort of how do you build and work out the relationships, and you know, I'm sure Jasper, you know, a lot of people don't write it down. I just sort of diagram what often people just scribble in the back of a notebook, but it's working out those connections and then working out, well, how much interaction do I need with that person? You know, is it a weekly or daily? Is it occasional? Are they interacting on those bits? And you can then start sort of put those bits in. You don't necessarily need to do it as a named person. It could be an organisation or an entity. The other template, talking templates, is trying to understand the issues. As you have a discussion, you come across an issue that they've got with it, and then trying to work out, well, has anyone else got the issue with it? And it is quite interesting as you go around talking to people and building those relationships and getting an understanding, you suddenly realise they've also got those issues as well, and you start to sort of build it together, so which allows you to work out who's influencing what and who's affected by what. It's another template that hopefully may be of use to people.
Yes, well, here's a good one for you from Scott McLean. This will get your brains working, I think. Do the panel agree that overt resistance from stakeholders is at least engagement, and that it's the stakeholders that stay quiet that are the biggest problem? In other words, the ghost stakeholder, the ones that you can't see or hear.
And that usually, in my mind, Ian, signals that might be a larger problem in the organization. Is it that we are working in an organization that's very hierarchical? Is there a culture of fear where people don't feel safe to speak out? So all these are sort of important considerations I think we may need to navigate as we are looking to deliver our new system.
Well, that's a
I
follow-up.
agree. It's the non-vocal ones that are very important to also bear in mind.
Yeah, Thank you, Jasper. Here's a follow-up question for you. This was from me. If that's the case, how do you then try and deal with that silent stakeholder?
Oh, for me, I would try and find a way to establish a connection with them in some way or form. Try and find out a little bit more about what their role is in the organization, and then try and understand a little bit more about what they do, and then just try and get a little bit of a conversation going that way. That could be one way, that could be the formal way. The other way I think that has helped me a lot in the past is what I call water cooler moments, where you sometimes meet people who are going to put the kettle on, and you just try and get chatting with them that way, and then try and start a conversation that way. It's always easier to do it that way, I find, rather than trying to force the conversation by approaching their line manager, for example. I've not really found that approach to be very helpful in the past.
Phil, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think, well, if I just bring this diagram up, because it allows you to visualize what I'm talking about here. I think in identification, and I agree, in sometimes identification, the quiet ones are not there. They just don't appear. They don't think they want to be involved. By having conversations and asking them questions, and as this one, Simon, say, well, who do you work with on that? Who's part of your team? What do they do? It's helping you understand the whole thing, but you suddenly find that there are people who start to appear. Now, you could, and there are some people in our profession who talk about sort of producing complete social networks, and there have been sort of very good stories about how that has identified where you've seen messages going, and asking simple questions like, who do you talk to about this? Who do you email about this? Why do you email that person about this? We're probably drifting a bit into the business analyst world, but as a project manager, I'm trying to identify stakeholders. That unpicking it may actually sort of help you identify the outlier, who you wouldn't have bumped into, who's hidden at the back of the factory if we were actually walking around the factory, who you don't know what's going on. So I think that's a approach of being slightly systematic as to how you can go around finding those sort of hidden people.
I've got a question here. Now, we might be sort of going into that area of engagement as opposed to identification, but I'd like you to have a think about this anyway. Once you've identified the stakeholders, how do you go about gaining their support? And I know we're broaching into the engagement part as well, but it's a good question to have a look at.
So sorry, Ian, once you've identified the stakeholders, how do you go about getting their support, is it?
That's right, yeah.
I think, Phil, that phrase you mentioned just now is really useful. I think, what's in it for me? To try and put ourselves in their shoes and try and see how they are going to be impacted by this change. Try and understand things from their perspective, and then try and see whether the change is going to be positive or negative on them, and then try and work with them initially to try and come up with a plan that way.
Thank you.
It's much easier if the change is going to affect them positively. Wow, that's wonderful. They can now be the champions for the new ERP system. But what if it's not? If it's going to affect them negatively? That will require quite a different, I think, sort of communication plan compared to where you just have people who are affected positively by it.
I think as an extension to that, there's a question come through from Rachel regarding managing the participation, the feedback and decision making, but in particular when you've got a high volume of stakeholders, so particularly a regional or a national change. I wondered as well, Jasper, if you had any comments on that, but specifically as well, Phil, linking that back to the ERP example that we led with.
Yeah, I think, Gareth, if that's the case, then if just say you have a large amount of stakeholders which are geographically dispersed at this point, then I think trying to find some way where we can create Teams meetings to meet with people if we cannot go and meet with all the different parts of the organization, for example, finding ways that they can contact you, having available hours where they can even do a Teams meeting with you might be a good start, or even creating some sort of simple templates or letting them know who you are, what you're trying to do, and providing email details, phone number, so they can start getting in touch with you and get the ball rolling that way. That could be a initial start.
And certainly in a lot of national organisations I've worked in, we've had things like intranet portals, shared mailbox where the project team can monitor any sort of side questions. And then you can also sort of sample how many people are actually going onto the intranet page. Is it actually working? Are people aware of it? Things like that. So there's some practical tools there as well, isn't there? Just to sort of flag the awareness. Because to Phil's earlier point is that if people are more aware, you're less likely to get the ones who don't know about it.
I think another thing which puts the question back into the identification is we're talking about identifying stakeholders. I think what's quite valid at this identification stage is identifying how the organisation now currently communicates. And I worked quite recently with a large retail company, and I was simply said, right, let's send the messages out, and they said, oh no, we communicate weekly. Oh, crumbs. I worked out that communicating weekly was quite good to the whole stores, and they had sort of over 450 stores nationwide, and that's how they did it. So everyone looked at the messages that came in. The communications came in on Monday, and they had a week in order to implement it. And at that point, you can suddenly see, well, this is a bit more complicated, and you had to use that methodology because that's what they did. Because if you started to use something else as a communication channel, you could actually create more uncertainty, and there was no guarantee the message was going to get out. So I think it was a wake-up call to me as to it's okay saying engage with them and you wander around your floor and talk to them, is actually make sure that you're using their methodology of how you do communicate now. You could obviously bolt stuff onto it, but it was certainly a wake-up call to me that we could only communicate with everyone weekly. And that was it. There was no other methodology.
There's a question that's come through. Once we've started to identify our stakeholders, and before we get into the engaging role, is there any way that we can start a hierarchical allocation of the stakeholder? Who holds the power in all of that? And it might not necessarily be the project sponsor or the person at the top. How do you think about going about that?
I can pick that up, Ian. I think you brought up a good point, which is, the first thing is who has got the power. So you've identified that there's power. Power is pretty key. But also, and I think it's, what are we trying to achieve? And we sort of talked about that earlier on, is why we're even doing this, is what are my objectives that I've got to achieve? So what are my initial objectives? Because that therefore gives me the urgency. So this group of stakeholders I have to engage with now, because otherwise I can't meet this particular project objective. It's linking stakeholder engagement with project objectives, and then adding that time criticality to it as well, as to if I don't have this information by this date, then this particular activity that I'm trying to do just won't happen. It will just fall apart. Also, which is, there are, as some of you might be picking up, there's relationships to risk management coming in here, but there's also the proximity. Who's the closest to me? I think, as Jasper brought out very early on, the scenario nicely gives us some members of my team. I think in the sort of working out my team would be quite quick in my hierarchy of who I want to engage with. My team is pretty close to me. As a proximity, but it's that proximity and urgency, and then the power related to the objectives with how I would go about it.
Thank you. I just put a question up there. Is that in your thought process, why do you think that various stakeholders on projects tend to shy away from the program? Why do you think people shy away from it? This goes back into the silent or the ghost stakeholder there. But why do you think people shy away from it? Is it a
Ooh.
case if I do nothing, it won't happen?
Well, Ian, I think there's something to be said here about psychological safety or the lack of it. People may feel they are not important enough in an organization to speak out. They may feel that, oh, there are many layers down, and normally their manager or their senior manager is the one who passes opinions back, and therefore their opinion is not valid. They may feel that could be one reason. Another reason could be they may feel they are exposing themselves or perhaps their lack of expertise by asking certain questions, and that might be enough just to try and make them not engage with you. So I think it's trying to ensure that we sort of give this message that we're creating a safe space. There's no such thing as a stupid question. There's no such thing as stupid opinions. If we are going to do this, if we are going to deliver the system, we need to really understand what we're going to use the system for, who's going to use it, and very importantly, what problems it's going to solve. And then we can work together with everyone to try and create something that's fit for purpose. What do you think, Phil?
Yeah, I think as you were talking there, I sort of realised another thing that sort of comes up in that is if they're not wanting to be involved, they need to be motivated to be involved. And there's a certain amount of leadership, obviously, as a project manager you can apply, and you've brought those out. But what I've also found is that an organisation will have its own leadership structure. is to try and break that mould of I don't want to get involved. If it's a senior manager in that position, then that's a little bit more challenging. But to try and use their own structure to sort of get the leadership going is to go back to them saying, look, I'm not getting much involvement from this particular part of the organisation. Is there anything you can do to make that happen? Because they've already got the established relationships. They understand the people. They're already acknowledged as the leaders and the motivators of those people. That might help. It certainly help you because obviously as a project manager, leader, in this scenario that you've asked Ian, there's a block. There's something not quite right happening there, and that this stakeholder needs motivating by a leader of sorts. And I would try to begin with to use the existing organisation's leadership structure.
Yeah. Phil, it's interesting you say that because in my previous role as a contractor, it was how they communicated in the organization in the sense that contractors were never introduced to the rest of the organization. We are just a background part of the fabric. And my line manager decided, I'm not having that. Jaspal has to come in here. She's going to upset all your worlds by changing how our target operating model works. So he made it a point that when they had their weekly sort of cascade meeting to introduce me, and everyone was kind of shocked because, oh, this is not how we do things, and he's doing things slightly differently. So having someone, a member of the ExCo or a senior manager, be brave enough to try and do things a little bit differently often can help set things off on the right foot, I think.
I like that.
Yeah, I'll go from Chris, and it's got two questions, and I'll put them both together at the same time. And again, we're broaching into sort of engagement as opposed to identification, but there is a link in what Chris is asking. Is that how do you manage a stakeholder, and we'll come back to managing and engaging, who has low power, high interest into high power interest because due to promotion, somebody gets from some sort of who's got low power but high interest, and he suddenly becomes high power and high interest due to promotion, for example. And the other part of it is how would you manage a high power, high interest stakeholder who is against your project? So what we're looking at here,
against your project.
yeah, what you're looking at here is that somebody who has got high interest and now becomes high power. He had low power, now becomes high power. What difference is that going to make in how you go about, I'll use the word engaging, but identifying that stakeholder, because he will have moved on your stakeholder mapping area, and the importance of that person may or may not have changed. What do you think?
I think yes, it's putting in the context. I need to understand the context as to why that particularly sort of had happened,
Yeah.
and what because obviously that they have they changed role. What did their influence? I think what it brings out actually a completely different point. So I'm sorry, Chris, I'm using your question to sort of bring out another very valid point that we all experience, is that stakeholder engagement is forever in some respects. It goes on, and it's dynamic and changing. And so you've Chris brought up a structural change that has changed the whole stakeholder map that I beautifully drew out. But also what's happening is politics is changing. In an ERP thing, suddenly a department realizes that all its processes are going to have to change and it's going to have to restructure. Well, the political dimension of that particular of the company that we're dealing with will dramatically change, and so that interest and influence, they weren't interested because their department wasn't going to get this module until 2027, and suddenly you as a project manager have announced that they're going to get it at the end of 2025. Well, that suddenly changes the whole thing. They've now suddenly gone from, well, I'm not really interested actually, I've got low interest. They've now got really high interest, and it's why have they got that high interest? Because that has happened. It could then lead to the second part of the question, Ian, which is the sort of high influence and high interest should be an outcome of that. But I think that the key point of this is that the stakeholder world, that whole stakeholder system, is alive and it's adapting and happening it all the time. I don't know what your thoughts are, Jasper.
It'll be really interesting to understand a little bit more of the context, I agree, Phil, behind this question. But if, for example, this stakeholder is now high power and high interest, it makes me wonder, have they received a promotion in the organization? And my first step might be really to congratulate them on that. And then next, I want to understand how is their role going to change? Are they now going to be very much more pressed for time, or is this now going to have a much bigger impact on their department? And that might mean the way I communicate with them in terms of my communication strategy might change. They may very well go, in my stakeholder influence metrics from someone who should be kept apprised of updates occasionally to someone who needs to get regular updates, say weekly or more often than that. And what's really important, right, is that whether they see a need to change the plan, is this going to affect our requirements in any way? So this happens so often during program and project delivery, doesn't it? Someone new comes in, totally pulls the rug out from under your feet, and you sort of have to manage that. So I think, that's a really good question. It's a real challenge we all have, I think, sometimes.
Yeah. There's a thought here that says, all right, we go through the exercise of identifying our stakeholders and we carry out the various stakeholder mapping process. But organizations change, and I think part of what Chris was talking about there was a change in the organization. What is your perception of the danger of the fact that if an organization changes and new people come in, often at sort of middle to senior management, and we don't actually acknowledge the fact that they could be a stakeholder?
I think
what's the risk of not identifying the correct stakeholders?
Yeah, which is why I think it's that what we're describing with this stakeholder identification process is it is iterative and it is a cycle. It would be, I would suggest, very unwise to say, I've done my stakeholder identification, right, let's get on with the engagement bit now. That's it's tick boxing. It cannot happen, and I've drawn out the parallels with risk management, and risk management is all the time. Risks are appearing and assumptions are appearing and dependencies are appearing. It's the same with stakeholder identification and therefore the subsequent stakeholder engagement, because new stakeholders are appearing all the time. And I can't remember, a little while ago we had a question as to, how do we sequence it? Well, and into which ones do we engage first in a hierarchy? I think the questions being, well, that hierarchy could suddenly change. The hierarchy will change throughout the life cycle of the project anyway, or program. It'll also change as the structural changes. It'll also change as people, and I think we've all seen this, suddenly become interested in what we're doing. It's suddenly the proximity's got a bit closer to them, and they've suddenly appeared, and they're starting to make a noise. So I think my takeaway from this question is, don't just do it. It is continuous. In many respects, it could even be a daily activity. As you engage with people, you'll come across the stakeholders you didn't even know they were there.
Phil, you've put up a couple of eyes, and we've had a little discussion on stakeholder identification tools and stuff you've talked, and we've got one here. Could you elaborate on the use of these stakeholder identification tools to help flag stakeholders who have conflicting interests on a project? Food for thought.
A very useful thing, I think, because it helps you understand which are your pinch points, where you're likely to get conflict, and where you may need to devote resource in terms of escalation of issues towards your board or exco. So conflict is inevitable, isn't it? Especially if you're bringing in a system that may impact different people in different ways. So I think, understanding this is really important. It gives you insight, and then it helps you sort of tailor your plan as you go along.
Yeah.
Phil? I think I'll just bring up, because we were talking about tools, this particular tool here, although we've certainly, I think, I can't remember where this particular tool comes from. It's not a new tool. But I think what this webinar has sort of identified is adding the dynamic nature to this, because I think that's what the question is bringing out, is we can identify the issues, and we can see who's involved in that issues, and we can see some of the conflicts that this will do. But I think adding the other question into this now changes this, makes the problem wider, because what we're saying is that, we've done this work, aren't we wonderful? What we're now saying is, no, new issues are appearing which are in conflict with the other issues. And I think being, in some respects, a tool such as this allows you to visualize it and see it. You're sort of modeling it to see how it works out, and you can play around with it as to what are the causes and what are the impacts of those things. And there's a bit of a sort of a cause and effect sort of activity you could do based on this particular tool. But the question was about tools. This is probably a starter, but I think this webinar has brought out a whole new world, is to try and work out that these tools are dynamic in their own sense. So once you've completed them, you're going to have to get them back out again as new issues come in as to whether that affects your whole view and perspective of the activities.
Thank you. Here's an interesting one that's come from Sophia, and I'm not myself, many years of project management, I've not really come across this before, but she says, how can I ensure I haven't identified the wrong stakeholder and taken them on the journey of the project?
Oh, love that question.
So do I.
I like it because, and as I advertise myself, I'm going to bring up, because everyone likes systems thinking, I'm going to bring up a little architect, and Gareth will be quite pleased with this, is it happens because of this. Because, oh my gosh, the sponsor wants an update by the end of the week as to what I've done. How many times as a project manager we come across that, and I haven't actually identified with the right person. So I'll find someone who knows something about it. They might not be the right person. And to begin with, it all is wonderful. That person gives you the right answers that you think you want. But you've made a massive assumption, which comes back to my other point of assumptions. That person was the right person. And so you've near enough got to do a sort of bit of risk management on your stakeholder that you're actually doing, because the unintended consequences, which I think is what Sophie's inferring, is that you engage with the wrong stakeholder, and you realise that, and now you've lost the time, because you've now got hours to find the right person rather than days to write the right person. And this sort of archetype of fixes that fail is very evident in stakeholder engagement, for the very right reasons that we as humans we've got to move fast on projects. We can't just say, dear sponsor, I'll get back to you in a couple of months when I've had a good think about it. The real world, as everyone who's watching this today knows, isn't like that.
I think just to add to that as well, folks, I think that's a really good point. Is I think without context, it's difficult to answer to some extent. However, is it possible in that particular scenario that you had, I don't want to call them a temporary stakeholder, but actually in the fixes that fail example, they may be a stakeholder in the fix, really, the sticking plaster, the sticky tape, but actually they have no long-term purpose on it. So we often talk about, I think there's a bit of a textbook idea that stakeholders all start and finish at the same time. But as we know, some stakeholders actually identify them at the start, but you don't actually really do an awful lot with them until midway through the project. Equally, they may start at the start, but actually they drop out before the kind of the final piece. They don't all have to start and finish at the same times, really. I think that's probably one of the key parts. So in that example, you probably would argue that they are a stakeholder, because of that definition right at the start, because presumably they went along on that journey that they were kidnapped along to kind of go to the question, but they felt or they perceived at the time they were a stakeholder. And it sounds to me in that particular example, eventually through wider understanding, they kind of deemed themselves, actually after all that, they realised they weren't. But at the same time, I think there's two answers to that. One of them, they were a stakeholder based on that perception. And second, I guess really, it's about risk and balancing risk, that surely the risk of taking a perceived stakeholder on the journey where it turns out they weren't really a stakeholder, it's far better to have that than somebody a genuine stakeholder that you omitted by accident, really. Because I think coming right back to the start of the webinar, we talked about those silent stakeholders, and I must admit, we've all come across them, really. Those is it skilled arsonists? I've heard them referred to as from a book. The people who are snubbed and they will go out of their way to work against your project. I think we have to be. I am a cynic, but we have come across all these people as well. So I think the risk of missing somebody is far more deadly than accidentally bundling the wrong person in the car, really.
That's right. I think too much engagement is not as bad as no engagement, and I think nothing people feel more slighted about as when they feel forgotten about. I agree, Gareth.
We're coming close towards the end, and we've got some wrap-up stuff to do before we end. So here's a final question for the panel. I'd like to thank all the audience for all their questions. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much. Here's a final question for the panel. Do you agree or not that the environment is an equal stakeholder in many projects, and how do you go about identifying the environment?
Wow. Go on, Phil. Sorry.
No, I think that is the first thing you have to do, is to understand the environment in which it's going on. And I talk about sort of a bit, looking at it as a business model. So you've got that part of the environment, asking what are the issues, why are we doing something, gives you another viewpoint, and asking lots of different stakeholders that same question. I think those. That lovely slide I brought up where it talked about the influences is really clear. If you don't understand the environment, it's quite difficult to work out how you're going to engage that stakeholder, is my feeling. Sorry, Jasper.
That's okay, Phil. It's interesting because, you see, as someone who is a physical geographer by training, my immediate bias is to identify the environment as the physical environment. So I would think, right, if we are creating something, it wouldn't hurt as well to try and understand to do an environmental impact assessment to find out how this is going to actually affect the physical environment, if it's going to have any negative ramifications. Because if that's the case, then we can try and put in place mitigating measures. But yeah, that's a sort of most probably that's not quite the answer to the question that was posed, but yeah, the environment is an important stakeholder, and I think people are now very much more aware than say 30 years ago of their carbon footprint and things like that. So yeah, it's a very good, important consideration, I think, to bear in mind.
I think what we're talking more there about is the natural environment, the climate, the etc., and rather than the environment within the project. It's more to the sort of the natural, the nature environment, and how do we identify with that. HS2 is a clear example where all sorts of problems have hit because of environmental change to the surrounding areas. And it's how an environment is a stakeholder. How do you know
it's a question of whether you're talking about the impact on biodiversity, whether you're talking about the impact on the physical waterways or the land, if this is a big, say, mining project. So yeah, there's many considerations to take on board. I agree, Ian.
Yeah. And I say we've got a couple of minutes. That was a quicker answer than I anticipated. Louise has come up and said, how do you use tools such as Pestle and VUCA for this? Or can you use Pestle and VUCA for this? Pestle certainly.
Certainly use Pestle. Another tool that sort of actually, notwithstanding your points on the environment, that you can use to sort of give you a view is one that I've got here, is to have a whole, is getting that sort of view. I think you can make an acronym that says pop it out of it. And some of you who are sort of managing successful programs will realise that there's another tool in here. And so Pestle is there. I think VUCA is really valid, and in my answer to the very first question you gave us, Ian, I was near enough sort of using that as a framework to try and get my initial feeling as to what is actually going on. What are the uncertainties? How is it complex? How complex? What are the complexities? So I think those come out quite loud and hard. So I fully agree that those are valid.
Thank you, everybody. We're coming to the point where we've only got a couple of minutes left, and I know that Maya wants to give us some closing remarks on that. What we look to do now is for future webinars with the two interest networks is to ask you what you would like us to discuss a bit more, particularly around stakeholders. We've talked a little bit today about stakeholder identification, and we've sort of morphed into a bit of stakeholder engagement as well. But if you let us know through your questions and your feedback after this webinar what it is you would like us to have a look at next, we want to have a look at those and design something to come back to you to meet your requests. Thank you to everybody on the panel for all their contributions. Thank you to the audience, and wish you a very pleasant day. Thank you.